Police-community relations are once again among the top stories nationwide, from Charlotte to Tulsa to Columbus, and Donald Trump calling for greater use of stop-and-frisk everywhere. In New York, the recent debate has been not just about what police reform is needed, but how it should be done. When the city council set aside a proposal called the Right to Know Act to allow the NYPD to reform itself, many advocates and even council members cried foul. Here to discuss that decision, the proposals themselves, and the state of police community relations here and across the country are Mark Winston Griffith, Executive Director of the Brooklyn Movement Center and a member of Communities United for Police Reform. Welcome back to BK Live, Mark.
Thank you.
Joseph Giacalone, a retired NYPD Detective Sergeant who teaches at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Thanks very much for being here, Professor. And Michael Sisitzky, a Policy Counsel at the New York Civil Liberties Union. Thanks for being here, Michael. So last night we all tuned into the debate, perhaps not willingly, but because it's our duty as citizens. Professor, what was your reaction to the talk about law and order, as Donald Trump said, policing? Were you surprised by anything you heard?
Yeah, I was surprised to bring this up on a first debate about stop, question, and frisk, and even crime rates. And he was actually off by his murder numbers. He talked about how murder was up in New York City. It's down slightly, but you know, it's just it shows that how much of a focus that crime and law and order is going to be coming up in this election.
And does that make sense? I mean, generally we've seen, I think Secretary Clinton talked about the decline in crime since '91, which, you know, has not always been reflected in the rhetoric, but certainly the numbers have generally shown that. Are we seeing some change in that? Well,
what I really think was going on is we've reduced crime about 50% over the last 20 years or so. And I think a lot of people, especially on the right, feel that that's in jeopardy now with a lot of different things that are going on. So what happens is that this becomes this focus about it, and it's just not so much about police-involved shootings. It's about, you know, stop, question, and frisk, and a lot of these other issues that we see now that have popped up in the community. It really stems from proactive policing, the ability to go out there aggressively looking for, you know, quote unquote, the bad guys. And this is what's caused some of the rift now. Because why, in my opinion, the police department failed to take its foot off the gas, like when crime was down so low, and they continued to push these things effort, whether it was broken windows, whether it was stop, question, and frisk, and a lot of these things. So one of the things that I like to see them talk about is what I look at is the real problem behind a lot of these things is CompStat. You know, stop, question, frisk is just a symptom of CompStat, which is that computer statistics about the accountability of police commanders to try to keep their crime down within a certain area.
Let's talk more about that in a second. Michael, NYCLU obviously involved in advocacy around stop and frisk here in New York. I was just surprised to hear that term used. Is that something that, it seemed like, obviously it's a New York-centric debate. We have two New Yorkers on the stage, but do people even understand what stop and frisk is around the country? Is that broadly known in law enforcement circles?
Well, it's certainly a tactic that's used by departments throughout the United States. I think what was so remarkable about the conversation about stop and frisk at last night's debate was just how much of it was off base. You know, we heard a candidate describe the tactic as a very effective tool of policing to reduce crime, to get guns off the streets. And that's just not the experience that New York City has seen. It's not the experience that other police departments throughout the country have seen as well. What stop and frisk really was the way that it was employed by the NYPD, particularly under the Bloomberg administration, was the harassment of New Yorkers of color. At its height in 2011, there were nearly 700,000 stop and frisk incidents of officers going up to people, doing a frisk, a pat down for weapons, asking questions, looking for evidence. And 80% of the people, more than 80%, were completely innocent of any wrongdoing, and nearly 90% were people of color. So what the practice was the targeting of communities of color under this what we see as quota-driven policies by the NYPD, trying to drive up their numbers.
Let's hear how Donald Trump contextualized it. We have a clip of the debate. Let's take a quick look.
Thousands of shootings. And I'm saying, where is this? Is this a war-torn country? What are we doing? And we have to stop the violence. We have to bring back law and order in a place like Chicago, where thousands of people have been killed, thousands over the last number of years. In fact, almost 4,000 have been killed since Barack Obama became president. Almost 4,000 people in Chicago have been killed. We have to bring back law and order. Now, whether or not in a place like Chicago you do stop and frisk, which worked very well, Mayor Giuliani is here, it worked very well in New York, it brought the crime rate way down. But you take the gun away from criminals that shouldn't be having it. We have gangs roaming the street, and in many cases, they're illegally here, illegal immigrants. and they have guns, and they shoot people. And we have to be very strong, and we have to be very vigilant. We have to know what we're doing. Right now, our police, in many cases, are afraid to do anything. We have to protect our inner cities because African-American communities are being decimated by crime.
Your 2 minutes has expired, but I do want to follow up. Stop and frisk was ruled unconstitutional.
So, Mark, your reaction to that, Trump's rhetoric, and then also, we're not going to watch it now, but Secretary Clinton's response to that, where she talked a little about gun control and a lot about implicit bias.
Sure.
What did you think of that exchange?
Well, I think what Donald Trump was doing is consistent with what he's been doing throughout the entire campaign. This is yet another dog whistle, but it's a certain kind of dog whistle, one that harkens back to days that we haven't seen in a while, which is, where New York and urban centers around the country have just been painted as these jungles where the black and brown animals have just run wild. And what law and order is needed is a way of taming these wild animals. And so when Donald Trump talks about law and order, when he talks about stop and frisk, he doesn't know very much about the policy, has very little understanding of its impact in New York City and other places. But what he does know is how his base will react to that. He understands that people are generally scared. Many people are generally scared of brown and black people. They think they're taking their jobs. They think that they're a threat to them. And so this is a way, folded into this idea of like, we're doing you a favor, black and brown people, by doing this. This is a way of sort of telling white folks out there that we will find a way to control these people. That's what it spoke to me. And I think that if you're a black and brown person, you've lived through stop and frisk in New York City, that's how you will interpret that as well. So I think that Hillary Clinton's response was a bit, I think it was, adequate. It was a bit tempered. I think could have gone a lot harder. And I'm glad that she actually did, I think at some point in time, use the word racism in her response, because I think that this is all folded in racism. That again is that we use the terms like law and order and other things, but at the end of the day, it's a vision of black and brown people as a threat.
So, Michael, let's bring the conversation back to New York. Obviously, the references to stop and frisk last night are kind of a dated conversation for the city because that tactic's not used very much here anymore. But the conversation here has been about this Right to Know Act. Can you tell us a little bit more about what was involved in that proposal? What are the things that were part of it? It's actually two bills, I guess. What was that supposed to involve?
So the Right to Know Act grew out of community experiences dealing with aggressive and abusive policing. These proposals get at some of the daily abuses that people experience in some of the most common low-level encounters where they're stopped by an officer. One of the kind of basic underlying things that underlie any conversation is knowing the person that you're talking to and knowing what's going on in that situation. So just at the start of this interview, we introduced ourselves, said who we were. That's one of the issues that the Right to Know Act gets at. It would be a requirement for police officers to say who they are when they're stopping someone and open a line of dialogue at the start of an encounter that could set a more calm and even tone and keep things from escalating. So it would be a requirement that the officers say who they are and why they've stopped the person, and at the end of an encounter, give the person essentially a business card. The officer's name, their badge number, and the number for the Civilian Complaint Review Board in case there was a need for the person to file a complaint stemming from that encounter. So that's one of the bills. The other bill gets at a tactic that we had seen really running rampant when stop and frisk was at its height, but that still continues, which is unlawful searches of New Yorkers. If an officer wants to search someone, they need to have a warrant, they need to have probable cause, or some other exception. One of those exceptions could be that a person consents and agrees to be searched by an officer. But what we saw on the street were officers really taking advantage of the fact that people didn't know that when an officer was telling them to open their bag or empty out their pockets, that the officer was actually asking for that person's consent, and never explained that the person actually had the right to refuse to comply with those orders.
And this bill would have done that.
This bill would require the officer to
Joe,
get
tell
that
me what
consent.
you think about the underlying critique and that proposal. Does it make sense?
Well, some of it does. The issue is, one of the other things I wanted to add in there about when the officer can search you is during stop, question, and frisk. It's known as a Terry stop. It's a U.S. Supreme Court decision where if the officer has reasonable suspicion, they don't even need probable cause, that the person's carrying a weapon here in New York City, that they can now search inside your clothes for it. So if I see something or feel something that appears to be a bulge or it could be a weapon, I can reach into your clothes and get it. Now, many other states go even further than that, and they use what's called a plain touch, where if I reach into your pocket and I feel what's crack vials, they can actually reach in and take it. We don't do that here in New York City. So we have some other limitations about what the police can actually do in here. But getting back to the stop, question, and frisk aspect of it in the search, this is, as I said earlier, that how this is driven by CompStat. I know we use the word quota. It's not so much a quota, but it comes down to the fact that if your crime numbers are up and you're the captain, and they're saying, well, your stops are down, you're having these shootings are up, there's a correlation between the two. More people are carrying guns. So what happens is, like, say the three of us, you guys were all captains, and I was up there getting basically tortured up there. What do you think the message goes back to? Your message goes back to your commanders and say, your lieutenants say, listen, we got to get more of these stops because I'm not going to be the guy that's going to get yelled at next time around.
So that context, Mark, now that the right to know proposal has been moved from the City Council and the force of law to an internal set of reforms that the police department has promised.
Right.
Given that that's sort of the background of what happens at police headquarters, do you have confidence that the reforms will actually stick if they're not codified?
Well, look, excuse me, I think that as reformers and as advocates and as organizers, we're really trying to do a lot of different things simultaneously. And I think that those of us at CPR and at the Brooklyn Movement Center don't harbor any illusions that this is any great fix. But what it does start to do is it starts to remediate the interaction between police officers and civilians. And that's an interaction that has needed some intervention for a long time. It's trying to create a new set of protocols and a new set of rules that govern the conduct of police officers, and actually try to create some, semblance of respect and civil liberties into that interaction. So I think that if we keep up the pressure and right to know is passed in those two different bills, I think it will have an impact. But I think that obviously the fight will need to continue. I think that there are a lot of different ways in which police interactions need to be transformed.
This is actually Act 2 of an earlier reform fight. The Right to Know Act are two elements of what was once a four-element Community Safety Act, passed in 2013, very controversial. It expanded the definitions inside the profiling law and created the Inspector General's office.
Right.
So that office has existed now for more than 2 years, as well as the other profiling reforms. What do you think about the impact of that earlier wave of reforms? Were they effective?
I still think it's early. So, I mean, I think it's a little bit too early to tell how effective it has been. I think that we finally have some semblance of independent oversight, if you will. I think there's still a concern that the office is not strong enough. And it oftentimes has to do with, it depends on who that person is in that position. So I think it's a little bit early to tell. And I don't know if Michael has any thoughts on it, because it's something that at CPR we've been watching fairly closely.
Well, Michael, actually, broader question. I mean, people have talked about Mayor de Blasio's record on police reform issues. Obviously, stop and frisk has decreased. He has said that they're limiting the arrests for low-level marijuana infractions. But he is still criticized by some in the reform movement for continuing broken windows policing. Do you think he's splitting the difference? Do you think he's playing it smart? How do you evaluate Mayor de Blasio's performance? Is he a reformer?
So he certainly ran on a platform of reforming the NYPD, but I think the changes that we've seen have not lived up to a lot of those promises and expectations. There was the announcement that they would scale back arrests for low-level marijuana possession, but now we see those on the rise again. He talked about the tale of two cities and how New Yorkers of color were disproportionately impacted by broken windows policing, and then appointed Commissioner Bratton as his first commissioner of the NYPD, who pioneered the tactic and continued it across our city. So I don't think that we've really seen the city live up to some of the promises about reform. And there's a lot of talk about how much the city council has or hasn't accomplished in terms of police reform and criminal justice reform. And it's also a council that has passed some transparency and oversight measures. And I think going back to the Community Safety Act, those are really integral oversight and transparency measures, and they can start to bring more accountability to the structure of the system. But in terms of making reforms that actually impact New Yorkers' daily experiences with law enforcement, those are the reforms that we really haven't seen come out of this administration or this council.
You are a retired detective sergeant, but I'm sure you still keep in touch with folks in the department, and obviously you know something of the mindset. What do you think cops think of reforms that have gone on in the city? Obviously, one might think they dislike them, but maybe they make their job easier by, preventing them from having to do things they didn't want to do in the first place.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of cops out there saying, great, I didn't want to do the stop, question, and frisk in the first place. So it was kind of being, forced upon. See, one of the things that I always talk about with the reform issues, sometimes it's the target's misguided. We're looking at individual officers instead of looking at the organization and the systemic problems itself. And most of the officers out there, they're just you go out there, this is what you're supposed to do. So that's why these things happen this way. But like what you were talking, Michael was talking about, this whole thing about Mayor de Blasio, he's a tale of two cities, right? Because he got on, most people would say that he got elected off an anti-police stance, and that's what helped him. Then he picks the poster child for policing with Bill Bratton to make up for it. Because why? He knew that the cops were going to shut down on him. He was going to have an entire police force that was going to do basically call 911, the cops are going to come. Police will always do their jobs. It's that proactive part that he was concerned about, and that's why he continued with the broken windows. Listen, I saw New York City go from the bad old days to the good days, and proactive policing was at the center of it. But when you have proactive policing, you have to make the decision. Do you want to deal with low crime rates and the citizens' complaints? Because that's what proactive policing brings. And it comes to a point now where the citizens are telling all the politicians that we don't want to deal with the proactive policing. We would rather see basically crime go up a little bit if we don't have to deal with all the intrusions and the minor issues that come with it. Because it's either you go 100% or you don't do anything at all. And that's really what we're at here, and this is what they need to fix.
What do you think about implicit bias? I mean, there's an issue that could be applied to many different sectors, policing just being one of them, but Clinton talked about that last night. Is that addressed in academy training now? Do you think there should be more of it? I mean, we've all got it, right?
Well, I could tell you something right now. Training is always the fundamental part of every police organization, and a lot of the problems that we deal with, that we see, especially with tactics and stuff like that, has to do with not adequate police training. It's very expensive, but we don't focus on the real issues, the recruitment, selection first, before we train officers. See, you're already stuck with the ones you got. So you have to worry about how you recruit and select people for the future. Mm-hmm. We need to have people that know how to communicate and talk to people better. And that's something that also needs to be brought out. But one of my complaints about the reform movement has been we always know who to fix with the police. We can go to the police commissioner. We can go to the mayor. But I never hear any about the reform movement about fixing some of the problems that we have in our communities, like the breakdown of the families, the school system is a mess. These are the things that there's no supervision at home.
Do you think that is a fair criticism of the reform movement?
No, it's a popular one. And I think that for every person who is working on police reform, quote-unquote, issues, there are 20 other people who are working on the very underlying issues that you're talking about. I mean, our organization included. Police accountability is just one of many issues. I think part of the larger problem that when we talk about these quote-unquote reforms is that we're trying to speak to an institution that is insistent upon making its own rules. And so when we talk about the Right to Know Act, and the way Bratton sort of approached it before is that he actually acknowledged that some of those reforms were common sense. And yet what he resisted was the idea of making it law, the idea that the police department would have to be held accountable in that way. And his pushback was that we're going to set our own sort of guidelines and laws. And that was part of the sort of the cultural fight that was going on, this idea that the police department should essentially be policing and regulating itself.
So Commissioner Bratton, we referred to him a few times. He is no longer that, and we have a new commissioner. Michael, do you expect to see any changes? I mean, Commissioner O'Neill is slightly younger generation, does discuss some elements of policing using different language. Are things going to change? Are things changing?
I think we have some concerns with the new police commissioner. He was very much groomed by Commissioner Bratton in his career and his development. And some would say that he was handpicked as the successor. So we fear that he will continue the kind of broken windows policing methods employed by Commissioner Bratton, but we also know that Commissioner O'Neill has expressed a commitment to engaging with the community, hearing community concerns and looking at models of neighborhood and community policing. So I think we would really challenge the new commissioner to actually sit down with community groups, sit down with Communities United for Police Reform, the NYCLU and others, and really listen from and hear from the community what kind of changes they want to see on the street. And as Mark said, a lot of those changes can't come from just within the department itself. We've trusted the NYPD to police itself for decades without any real change or progress. Chokeholds were banned in the patrol guide, and Eric Garner was still killed by one. We have similar provisions to the Right to Know Act are already in some segments of the patrol guide. Officers are supposed to identify themselves and give their badge number when asked. They're only supposed to do consent searches when the person actually has given voluntary consent. So they're changing some of the wording in the patrol guide, but that's not enough. We need to see some changes both within the department but also externally to get at the more systemic problems.
I want to ask about that, Joe, kind of a final thought. Right now, on the streets around us, there are thousands of officers patrolling. They're not in the academy anymore. They're not reading the patrol guide. Does the and you train police officers at John Jay now. Does the training actually translate into what they put into practice on the street? Does it matter once they get their degree, throw their hat in the air, and become an actual practicing police officer?
Of course it does. I mean, it's like everything else. How you're trained is how you're going to, play your game, so to speak, right? How you practice is how you play. That's why training is very important, and it's done in the police academy. But like everything else, we have some officers that just don't, follow what they're supposed to do. And then you need to figure out how you deal with those accordingly. I mean, and this happens in every organization, and you have to figure that out. And I can say before, the public wants this type of reform. Some of it should be put into place. So, like, for instance, the thing that I don't agree with is this handing out the card bit. I think you're going to see less interactions, in my opinion, where police are going to actually back off that community policing aspect. Because if I don't have a card on me, I don't want to be bothered. I don't want to give somebody the opportunity.
Yeah, but isn't there something wrong with that? I mean, if you are a public servant and your role is to protect a particular community, and on the side of the card it says CPR, right? Isn't it your job and your role to identify yourself to someone and to establish a positive engagement with that person from the very beginning?
Certainly it is, but once again, we're talking about individual officers. We're not talking about a blanket statement that we can say all officers need to follow this. We're dealing with the psychological aspect of individuals, which is impossible to change.
Do my best, not Lester Holt impression, and actually intervene here. Thank you guys.
Oh, no.